Testing 1, 2, 3. All right, everyone, it is 7 o'clock here in Central Time, and we're going to get started on this UAS 101 webinar question and answer. My name is Travis Balthazar. I'll be your instructor tonight for this webinar. Just to kind of let everybody know, we actually have participation from 33 states and even 4 different countries. So great turnout for this event, and we're really excited to talk to you all about UAS. The reasoning behind this course was that a lot of people receive unmanned aircraft systems, drones, whatever you want to call them, for Christmas. And so they get these presents and they don't know what to necessarily do with them, what they can and cannot do with them. So spreading the word out there about what you can and cannot do is one of the perfect things that we think that we're good at here at K-State. And so we're going to go over those things, and feel free to ask questions as we go through this. Change my slide here. A little bit about myself. Again, my name is Travis Balthazar. I have a bachelor's degree in aviation technology. I got a minor in aviation safety, and I'm currently working on a master's in human factors, specifically for unmanned aircraft systems. I've been a flight instructor for 7 years, mainly for Kansas State University. So I've instructed many students on how to fly manned aircraft and get the required ratings to go to the airlines, to private industry, or wherever they want to go. On the unmanned aircraft system side, I was the UAS chief pilot for 2 years, and then my current position now is a UAS flight operations manager here at the Applied Aviation Research Center at Kansas State University Polytechnic. So the overview about what we're going to be going over tonight, the first thing we're going to talk about is how to ask questions. I got a couple slides that just demonstrates the software package that you all have now in front of you and how to actually ask questions. We're going to talk a little bit about terminology, so that way if I say something that, an acronym that you don't know, hopefully you can remember it. We're going to talk about a little bit about K-State's background in unmanned aircraft systems. And then we're going to move into what are hobbyist operations and what are commercial operations. And then at the end, we're going to do a question and answer session. So to ask a question on your screen, there may be, and hopefully everybody can see my highlighted area here, there's going to be these 3 little dials here. They may be at the top of your screen, they may be at the bottom like they are here. However, if you look for the Q&A, that's going to be the button that you're going to want to utilize, and I'll highlight it here for you. If you come up with a question that maybe I did not speak clearly to one topic or another, feel free to push that button, and it's going to open the dialog box just like you see here. And go ahead and put in your question there and submit it. I have a team here that's working with me, and they're monitoring the questions as they come through. If it's a question that comes through from several different participants, it's obvious that I did not explain something really well, so they'll push that to a screen that I have here, so that way I can read it and reiterate better on that particular topic. The questions that are not relevant to that particular subject that we're talking about, we'll compile those for the end for the question and answer session. Obviously, we won't be able to get through all the questions tonight. Hopefully, there is a lot of them. I pride myself on getting all the topics right, but I'm sure there's going to be plenty of questions. So if we don't address your question tonight, here in the next couple of days, there'll be an email that goes out with all the questions, and we're going to answer each one of those. So just look in your email for those. In addition to that, tonight there's a lot of website links and different valuable tools that you can utilize going forward. And so as you see those links, don't feel like you need to write them down. Those will be in that same email that will be sent to you with all those links that you can just click on and take you right to that link. So be looking for that in your email over the next couple of days. All right, so we're going to go ahead and try this webinar poll question. And the first one's going to be simple. It says, do you currently own a drone, yes or no? And so here in a second, my associate here is going to push up a question. Looks like it's on the screen now. And so just go ahead and answer that, and we'll show you how you can pull, we can pull that information into a statistic. We'll give you a minute here just to go and click on that. Okay, they're still coming in, but it looks like right now we have about 64% say yes, they currently own a drone, and 36% say no. And if you were one of those no, don't worry, you're still in the right spot. This is not a webinar that you have to have a drone or UAS as a prerequisite. So this is going to be good information. Hopefully those that have answered yes, they still have it, meaning that if you got it for Christmas, hopefully you haven't crashed it yet or anything. We're here to help you with operating those things safely. So hopefully that's still the case, that they're still operational. All right, so let's move on to some terminology. So obviously the easiest one, at least I think, is KSU, which is Kansas State University. The next one is UAS, or unmanned aircraft systems. Third one is FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. NAS is National Airspace System. RPIC, Remote Pilot and Command. GS is Ground Station. And the last two are Section 336, which is the hobbyist regulations that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. And 14 CFR Part 107 is the commercial operations that commercial regulations that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. And my note down there is hopefully to remind me that you are all not as heavily involved into this industry as I am. And those acronyms over there on the left, I use on an everyday basis. So I'm going to try to program my brain tonight to use the full name and not just the acronym. So. All right, why do we say UAS and not drone? This question commonly comes up, and from here on out tonight, you'll probably mostly hear me say UAS, and this is the reason behind that. The FAA, or the Federal Aviation Administration, regulates aircraft in the National Airspace System. Therefore, unmanned aircraft systems are appropriately defined. This simply means that UAS fall underneath the same purview as manned aircraft from the FAA's point of view. So if there was any situation that was to arise with an incident with an unmanned aircraft systems, they're going, from the FAA's point of view, they're going to assume that that is an aircraft. So all these regulations are set around aircraft, and that's why they're found in the federal regulations under aircraft. Moving on to a little bit of history about Kansas State University, and particularly unmanned aircraft systems. We've been in operation for over 10 years now. We first started with the Greensburg tornado back in 2007. It was an F5 tornado that pretty much wiped out the town of Greensburg. And you actually see a picture up there in the top right-hand corner. It literally leveled the town. And due to our National Guard being deployed at that time, we really didn't have a good turnout for that natural disaster event. And so the state of Kansas realized that something had to be done. And so they reached out to Kansas State University as one of the entities to set up a UAS program. So in 2008, our program was initiated. And in 2009, we were tasked with the disaster response for Kansas. With that, we started offering a UAS certificate since we are a university. Now, as most of you probably know, that being in the natural disaster response industry is hopefully not a good industry to be in. Hopefully you're not getting called out multiple times for an event like that. So naturally, being a university, we progressed our certificate program to a 4-year bachelor's degree program in 2011, and we started conducting research for the UAS industry. In 2015, that was a big growth year for us. We really started to really invest into the UAS industry, and so we received several authorizations from the FAA to do a lot of different flights that weren't currently allowed to do for commercial use. We did those for aircraft certification, for research, and to just enable the technology for those here today doing this as a commercial operation. Also in 2015, we became a part of the FAA's UAS Center of Excellence, or also known as ASSURE. It's a consortium of universities that conduct FAA research specifically for the FAA. In 2016 through 2017, we started offering a hobby course, much similar to this one here, but specifically for hobbyists. And then we offered many training curriculum for our academic students. About halfway through 2016 in August, the commercial regulations that we're going to be talking about here in just a little bit were published, and those are the 14 CFR Part 107. Once those were published, a whole gamut of options came available to those that wanted to operate unmanned aircraft systems. So right after that, of course, the first thing everybody wants to do is get certified. So we offered and still offer today, a Part 107 course to help those that want to be commercial operators get their remote piloting command certificate. And then the last thing on here is we became a member of the Pan-Pacific Test Range Complex. This is very recent. So we're able to do test site work, which means that the operations that are still not legal today under 14 CFR Part 107, we can work with the FAA and our test site to actually conduct those operations for research purposes for the industry and for possibly regulations. All right, so just to get everybody up and running here, we're going to do a couple more poll questions. And so we have several questions coming up here, and all I want you to do on these poll questions is just to select whether you think it is a commercial or a hobbyist operation. So the first one is: a farmer purchases a unmanned aircraft system and utilizes it to fly over his own field, inspecting the irrigation sprinkler pivot. So this should be popping up. Go ahead and take a minute there and look to see whether you think that this is a commercial or hobbyist operation. I'll give you just a minute to look that over. All right, so it looks like we have most people saying that this is a commercial operation. In fact, that this is a commercial operation. I actually grew up on a farm out in western Kansas, and this is one of the hardest things I have to do is go do presentations and tell farmers that, you know, you own this land and you own the sprinkler pivot and you even purchased the aircraft. However, you're flying an unmanned aircraft system that's going to better your field, because in the FAA's mind, that if you fly over that sprinkler pivot and you find a sprinkler that is damaged or, you know, leaking a lot of water, what's the farmer going to do? He's naturally going to fix that problem, where then it's going to adjust its yield. Even though no money has been exchanged or anything, is still in conjunction with his commercial operation. All right, let's move on to the next one. And we'll clearly define these a little bit better as we move through the hobbyist and commercial regulations. All right, so here's the next one. An individual operates a UAS to take scenic shots of mountains. The photos are then framed and hung on his or her house. Hobbyist or commercial? All right, looks like we have everybody saying that it's a hobbyist operation, which is perfect because it is. This one's pretty straightforward, so there's not much to be hidden here. He's taking the photos and keeping them for himself and using them for his own personal enjoyment, which is pretty much the definition of a hobbyist. All right, the next one, just got a couple more here. An individual uses a UAS to record a friend snowboarding. He or she then uploads the footage to YouTube. Commercial or hobbyist operation? All right, so we got a pretty good split here. We say the majority say hobbyist, and I will agree that the way that this is written, and since I wrote it, I will agree that this is a hobbyist. However, if we add in this second clause here that says because he or she has hundreds of thousands of followers, they get paid by YouTube for the amount of content uploaded. At that point, yes, it does become a commercial operation. So it all depends on the back end. You know, they upload the footage, but if they have so many YouTube followers or Facebook followers or social media followers, and they're getting paid for that content that they are uploading, then it is part of their business. And so therefore, it actually counts as a commercial operation. But as the first statement is put up there, that would simply be a hobbyist operation if it's for personal enjoyment. All right. And the next one, a realtor is flying a UAS to take images of a house that will be up for sale soon. He or she does not collect money for the actual flight, but will take a commission on the house when it is sold. Hobbyist or commercial? All right, I turned my video back on. A couple people said it helps them with seeing my lips and everything. So this operation here is a commercial operation, which it looks like everybody is in agreement on. For a while, this was actually a big controversy that a lot of people thought, just like the farmer, that they're doing this in conjunction with their business, but they're not exchanging any money. You know, specifically, I put in that they're going to collect commission when the house is sold, so it kind of implies that. But for a while there, it was up for debate. But the FAA specifically defined that this is a commercial operation. All right, and the last one here, and then we're going to move on to the hobbyist regulation, is an individual is racing his or her UAS against other friends, hobbyist or commercial. All right, and everybody's in agreement there that it's a hobbyist operation. Very good. So just kind of a beginning assessment, just to see kind of where everybody's at. There was a few that we kind of had some where we were split between hobbyist and commercial. So we'll actually dive down into what is a hobbyist operation and what is a commercial operation. The FAA says there's three types of UAS operations. There's model aircraft, or also known as hobbyist or recreational use. There's civil operations, which are the commercial operations, and there's public operations, which are governmental. We will not be discussing the public operations and governmental tonight. We'll focus on the hobbyist and commercial operations right here at the top. So the first one's going to be the hobbyist operations. So more information, and it definitely will be included on the sheet that we send you in the email in the days to follow. But if you want to know and go cite the actual laws, they're going to be found under the Public Law 112.95, Section 336. And as an addendum to those, there's some FAA resources that are available. And one of those is a advisory circular, as they call it, that actually supplements that document. And then, of course, the FAA's UAS website is a fabulous place to find good information on the UAS industry and what is commercial and what is hobbyist. So feel free to look at those after this discussion. The things that we're going to talk about for the hobbyist side is going to be these listed out here over here on the bulleted side. And that's going to be strictly from the Section 336. This is specifically stated in 336 that this rule, operators must these things. And we're going to highlight each one of these as we go through here. So the first one is you must fly for hobby or recreational purposes only. And the best way to define that. And so we're going to say that recreational or hobby UAS is flying for enjoyment and not for work, business purposes, or for compensation or hire. UAS use for hobby is a pursuit outside one's regular occupation, engaged in especially for relaxation. And it even says right there at the end that it's specifically for strength and spirits after work. So this is really defining that, you know, if you're using it in conjunction with work, you're not falling under the hobbyist regulations. So The definition itself should help define whether you're going to be a hobbyist or commercial operation. You must register your UAS. If any of you have been watching the news here lately and you're subscribed to maybe to a UAS subscription or magazine, you'll know that for a while here, we have not had to register UAS for hobbyists. When the regulations first came out in 2016, it was a requirement, actually it was a requirement even before then, that you needed to register your aircraft as a hobbyist. However, through a court process, it was for several months not required. But as of late, very recently actually, President Trump has signed a bill reinstating the hobbyist registration. So note that if your aircraft is between 0.55 pounds and 55 pounds, you must register your aircraft as the law stands today. The online process, it costs $5 for a registration number, and that one registration number can be put on any one of your hobbyist unmanned aircraft systems. So if you go on to the UAS website for registering your UAS, which is down there at the bottom, you'll note that you'll get a registration, and it'll say that you can actually take that registration number and put it on all your aircraft. So for $5, you can put it on 5 aircraft, you can put it on 100 aircraft, it doesn't matter. But one thing that you should note is that the hobbyist registration cannot be used or transferred for a commercial UAS registration. So you can get a commercial registration later, but you cannot transfer the number that you get the first time as a hobbyist over to a commercial registration. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the commercial side. The registration must be marked on the UAS, and I got a slide showing where those can be marked. Failure to register your UAS may result in civil and criminal penalties. And those penalties for civil can go up to $27,000, and criminal penalties can go up to $250,000, or imprisonment for up to 3 years. So not registering your UAS is a big deal. And so it doesn't take long. The process is very, very easy, and it doesn't cost much. So please take the time to register your unmanned aircraft. Where are you going to placard that? You have a couple different options. You can actually engrave it onto your aircraft, the registration number that you get from the FAA through that online process. You can use a permanent label to put on the aircraft, or you can use a permanent marker. Here at Kansas State University, we actually just use a label maker, put it on the aircraft, and then put a clear piece of packing tape over the top of it. It works really well, and it's very nice and clean. One thing to note, though, is that the numbers must be visible or accessible. So what they mean is that you can put it in such things as a battery compartment or somewhere where it is concealed. However, you must put it somewhere where no tools are required to open it. So if your battery compartment or your cargo compartment where your camera is stored or something, you can put it in there as long as there is no tools required to access that compartment. So for us, we like making it visible. In the unlikely event that it does fly away or something goes wrong and somebody finds it, we want to be able to get that aircraft back. And having those numbers visible makes it easy for others and authorities to actually track that number back to you. If you have it hidden in a compartment, it may take a little bit longer for them to find it, or if they find it at all. So we typically have them very, very visible. Also from 336, you must follow a community-based set of safety guidelines. Here's an example. Academy of Model Aeronautics, AMA, is a really big community-based organization for UAS and RC aircraft. They've been around for a long time, and they got a really good reputation. They do offer insurance and a lot of different benefits through their subscription. So I do have an example listed out here of their guidelines that meet this requirement. So you can read through those, but as a high level, you know, it just kind of highlights what you can and cannot do under their purview. So you must follow those if you choose to go with the AMA program. So you'll also need to fly UAS that weigh no more than 55 pounds unless certified by a community-based organization. That could be AMA or it could be your local RC field. but there must be a process for them to certify that you can fly and that that aircraft is in a condition safe for flight. Once you have it certified by your community-based organization, you will need to register it, the UAS, via paper registration process, because the online process is really great, but it's only for aircraft that are 0.55 pounds to 55 pounds. So when you get above 55 pounds, the unmanned aircraft will have to be registered through a paper process through the FAA registration branch. I do have a link there that'll be included in the document to come to your email. But note that that paper process is not a quick process. You have to physically mail it to them. They have to go through it and look at it and then send the registration back to you through mail. They may have questions and they may call you and they may converse back and forth with you. So it is a lot longer process than the online registration, which typically only takes 5 to 10 minutes. So just know that as you get into larger aircraft, if you get in a larger aircraft, that's one thing that you may want to plan ahead for before you actually get to your first fly day. The next thing is you'll want to fly the UAS within visual line of sight. And what does visual line of sight mean? It means that the aircraft must remain close enough to the operator to be capable of seeing the aircraft without vision unaided, or with vision unaided by any device other than corrective lenses. So if you're standing out there and you're flying your unmanned aircraft and you're flying it and you no longer see it with your contact lenses or your eyes or glasses, then you're actually outside of the current laws for hobbyist aircraft. You need to keep it within visual line of sight. And that VLOS is a very common terminology used, so VLOS. So just kind of know that as we move forward. The operator must also operate the aircraft close enough to maintain situational awareness in case immediate or corrective action is required. So if you have it way out there and it's just this tiny little speck, yes, it is in visual line of sight. However, if there was a manned aircraft or an emergency that comes up, you need to be able to have situational awareness, meaning that you need to definitively know which way the aircraft's orientated and be able to take immediate control of it to either get out of the way of the potential hazard or lower the aircraft to a particular altitude. So just because you can see it does not mean that you're fully compliant. So make sure that you can actually have full control of the aircraft and know exactly what you're doing. You want to give way to manned aircraft and do not endanger other users of the National Airspace System. So it is recommended that a UAS for hobby use not fly higher than 400 feet above ground level. With a few exceptions, manned aircraft typically do not operate lower than 500 feet above ground level, so that's essentially giving you some separation there to where you have your bubble of 400 feet and below to operate, and then manned aircraft can operate higher. Yes, there is exceptions, crop dusters, military aircraft, and all those, and few others can operate at lower altitudes. However, it is the exception. So for the most part, you kind of have a little bit of an area there to operate. You also must operating a UAS higher than 400 feet can endanger manned aircraft traffic in the vicinity. So if you operate up at those higher altitudes, higher than 500 feet, you can be endangering those in the National Airspace System. So those manned air traffic and other operators that are flying at those higher altitudes. So be sure to be cautious if you are going to be flying higher than that. And that as far as the FAA is concerned, they really, really want you to operate lower than 400 feet. And also, this operating lower than 400 feet will significantly help you with that situational awareness of those low-level traffic. So if you have a crop duster or a military aircraft and you're operating at much higher altitude than 400 feet, it's really hard to, from the ground at least, to be able to tell where they're at. A lot of people say that the camera on the aircraft will help them visually see, the airspace and everything. That's not the case. And we have a lot of flying time around here. And I can tell you from firsthand experience that camera is looking through a soda straw. There is just no way to see and avoid all the air traffic around you in that, that 360-degree view. So be cautious when operating unmanned aircraft at higher altitudes than 400 feet with under the hobbyist regulations. Prior to a flight near an airport, you're going to need to provide notification to that local airport if you're operating within 5 nautical miles of the airport. And question I get often is, how do I know I'm operating next to an airport? You know, there's a lot of small airports that most people don't know about. And so when you're out there operating, you need to ensure that you're not operating near one of those to make sure you're complying with these laws. So the FAA actually provides a pretty good app, and there's several others out there that you can get into. I'm only saying this one for right now, and that one is Before You Fly. And what it allows you to do is go into the app and click on a location that will be flying at a later time, later that day or later the next day, and determine whether it's in within 5 miles of an airport. If you are out there already, you can still use it. It has a location device on your phone if you have it enabled, and they'll tell you exactly where you're at and then whether you're in that operating area or not. So to expand a little bit on that, how do you get a hold and notify the controlling tower? So if you find out that you're going to be inside of one of those 5 nautical mile rings, how do you notify the tower? Well, tower numbers, as far as the phone numbers, they're not widely published. So what you're going to need to do is probably contact the airport manager, which that number is widely listed. So you can look up the airport and then get the airport manager's phone number. Tell them, you know, what you're trying to do, and hopefully they'll give you the number to the tower. Once you get a hold of the tower, actually prior to getting a hold of the tower, there's a couple things that you're going to want to know prior to talking to them. Airport towers are really busy, and so you want to make sure you have all your information in a row. So write this stuff down prior to actually calling them. You want to state who you are and that you want to conduct a hobbyist operation within that airspace. You want to provide the operational area, so let them know where you're operating. That could be GPS coordinates, but they don't always have, you know, let's say a Google map or anything there to type those coordinates in. So having the coordinates is good in case they ask for them. However, it might be better to have some streets or, you know, an area that's easily defined visually for them as well. You want to tell them what time of day, how long you're going to be out there, and then a direct contact number. That way, in case something goes wrong or they get an aircraft that needs to land and fly directly over you for whatever reason, they can get a hold of you, so that way you know that aircraft's coming in and you need to get on the ground. One thing to know, that if you are a member of a club or organization that already has an established flying area, contacting the tower is not required, because that club has already communicated with the tower that this is where our operations are always going to be. They're going to be there continuously for hobbyist operations. And so usually they have an understanding that that is the operation where they're going to be. And so contacting the tower is not required. So that's the benefit, one of the benefits for actually getting in with a club or organization. That way you don't have to contact tower every time you want to go out and fly. And the flying facilities, depending on location, are often pretty nice. You'll never want to fly near emergency response efforts, large stadiums, or restricted areas. There's a lot of areas where you do not want to fly commercially or as a hobbyist. And the link here is long. Again, it'll be on the email that you'll be getting here in a couple of days. But prior to, if you're not going to be flying at a club sanctioned event, or you're flying at a new area, you're definitely going to look at where you're operating and see how it relates to these bulleted items here. Some of these are pretty obvious. You've probably seen the news that there was a DJI Phantom that actually landed on the White House lawn a couple of years back, which was a big deal. And there is a lot of areas like that where there should not be unmanned aircraft to begin with, and the penalties for those are extreme. Here lately, we've been seeing a lot of unmanned aircraft flying near wildfires. And the problem with that is that if you do not have authorization to fly near wildfires and you are spotted, they have to ground all the firefighting activities in the air. And so that actually happened here recently, I believe down in Arizona, where a manned pilot who was running fire suppression flights saw an unmanned aircraft and had to call in and tell all other aircraft to land. And they had to land the aircraft for several hours, which obviously made the fire progress way further. That guy that was flying is obviously facing some pretty extensive punishment for that. So be cautious where you're flying and don't don't fly just because you want that good shot. You know, be mindful of the safety of those that are in the air and those on the ground. Another one that we see often is stadiums or sporting events. If there's a stadium that has more than 30,000 people in attendance, which is pretty much in any big football or soccer or whatever activity, you cannot fly there just because of the danger that it poses to all those people in the stands. If you're thinking, oh, well, I could fly at smaller events like high school football games, stuff like that, that is the case. You can fly there. However, be mindful that you do not want to operate over the top of people. You want to make sure that you have proper authorization to be flying in that area. You know, let the appropriate authorities know, and make sure you're not flying in any of these other areas that we have listed out over here on the side. And the last thing I'll talk to is the temporary flight restrictions. Temporary flight restrictions are for all aircraft. And again, there's a reason why we call these unmanned aircraft systems, because these temporary flight restrictions apply to even manned aircraft, large and small and unmanned aircraft. And what those are is could be a presidential official going into an airport, landing to refuel, or going to an event. Anytime that there's an event like that, there's a temporary flight restriction that all aircraft have to stop flying in that vicinity. And there's a certain area and everything that's defined. Also, temporary flight restrictions often pop up around natural disaster events. So your wildfires, big tornadoes, hurricanes, and all that, temporary flight restrictions go out just to simply keep, you know, those that do not need to be in that area out. So that way the official aircraft that need to be in there doing the rescue efforts and helping with whatever situation is going on can actually get their job done. And that concludes the part of the hobbyist regulations. And so now we're going to move on to the commercial operations. And so if you've been thinking to yourself that, you know, there's a lot of things in there that, you know, I can't do because, you know, I want to do, you know, I want to be a realtor and I want to be able to use this for my business, or I'm a farmer and I want to be able to use this to go check my crops, then likely you're going to be on this commercial side. And so we're going to talk about what the regulations are and how to become certified to do these operations. So the commercial regulations and information, they can be found under 14 CFR Part 107, which is the actual regulations that state what you can and cannot do. The FAA Advisory Circular 107-2, it actually is a supplement to Part 107. And then again, I put in the FAA's UAS website because it is, again, a great source for information on unmanned aircraft systems, whether you're commercial or hobbyist. All right, so let's go over some of the highlights of a commercial operation. In some of these, you might notice that they kind of mirror a hobbyist operation, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But the UAS must weigh less than 55 pounds, and it is less than. So if you are right on that border and you have an aircraft that weighs 55 pounds, it technically does not fall into this Part 107 category. It must weigh essentially 54.9 pounds or less. You must keep the aircraft within visual line of sight, unaided by anything other than corrective lenses. So again, you need to keep the aircraft close enough to where you can have situational awareness of it and be able to take control in case something were to come up. Again, using the camera does not help you with that situation. This one is a definite. The UAS must not be flown higher than 400 feet above ground level. So as on the hobbyist, it is highly recommended that you stay lower than 400 feet. On this one, it is a definite. You cannot fly higher than 400 feet. There are a few exceptions. When operating around, let's say you're inspecting a cell phone tower for your company. When you're operating around that, there are some options for you to fly higher. So you can actually fly up to the highest point plus 400 feet around that, as long as you're within a 400-foot circumference of that. So there are extra limitations to that 400 feet, but for a high level, you cannot operate higher than 400 feet. You cannot operate in classes A, B, C, D, or E to the surface, and those are airspaces without prior authorization or waiver. And I know that most of you probably don't know what the difference is between a class A, B, C, and D, or E, but that is one of the requirements to get the commercial certification for the remote pilot and command certificate. Excuse me. So knowing what these airspaces are and knowing that which ones you can and cannot operate in is viably important to getting that certification. The only airspace that's not listed out up here is going to be Class G airspace. And Class G airspace, you're probably thinking, wow, if Class G is the only one I can operate, that's not very limiting. However, Class G at the low altitudes, we're talking to 400 feet, makes up a huge amount of the national airspace system. So we're talking over 90% of the United States is in Class G below 400 feet. So there is a lot of area where you can operate. Small unmanned aircraft may not operate over any person or persons not directly participating in the operation. And what do we mean by participating? Those people that are actively crew members, that means that they are flying the aircraft, they are operating the sensor, they are visually helping the crew fly that unmanned aircraft system, are those participating. If you are wanting to fly over a crowd and you let them know, hey, I'm going to be flying an unmanned aircraft system and we'll be flying over your head, that is not participating in the operation. You need to be able to fly the aircraft without flying over those people. So flying over large crowds, flying over, really anyone is not allowed under this Part 117 operations, because if one of these were to fall out of the sky and land on somebody, there's repercussions to that could be detrimental to that person's health. We're getting, just as a note, we're getting a lot of great questions, and if you don't get a direct reply in the question and answers, I'll address your question at the end of the webinar. My team here is looking at them as they come through, and they're saying there's a lot of good ones coming through. So keep them coming, and we'll answer them as they come through at the end here. Another one is daylight only operations, or civil twilight. And that is 30 minutes before official sunrise to 30 minutes after official sunset local time with appropriate anti-collision lights. So when the sun goes down, 30 minutes after the sun goes down or 30 minutes before the sun comes up in the morning, you can operate under Part 117 during that time if you have a anti-collision light that is visible up to 3 nautical miles. So you have to be able to have that lighting equipage on the aircraft to fly during that time period. There are several companies out there that sell a lighting, external lighting kit for your unmanned aircraft to actually put on your aircraft to meet that requirement. So know that you can operate anytime during the day, and also even 30 minutes after the sun goes down or the sun comes up in the morning if you have that anti-collision light. Again, your UAS must be registered if it's between 0.55 and 55 pounds, just like the hobbyist. It's a little bit different, however. It is, again, still $5, but it's $5 for every aircraft. If you remember right, with the hobbyist registration, it's $5 and you get one registration, and you can put it on any amount of unmanned aircraft that are in your possession. The commercial side, it's one registration per aircraft. So a copy of that registration must be in the remote pilot command's possession during flight. So when you go online and you register your aircraft, you'll get what's in the bottom left-hand corner down there. I'm gonna highlight here with my mouse. You'll get one of these, and it's got a little bit of information on the regulations, but you'll get one of these, and that registration needs to be in your possession while you're flying that unmanned aircraft. In addition to that, just like with hobbyists, the registration number must be on the unmanned aircraft as well. It's the same type of thing. You can engrave it, you can use a permanent label, you can use a permanent marker, and the same thing applies. It can be anywhere on the aircraft, including on the inside, as long as there's no tools necessary to take that apart. If the UAS is greater than 55 pounds, the UAS will need to be registered to the FAA registration branch. Again, it's not the easiest process. However, it is necessary if you're operating outside the realm of the 55 pounds, that you cannot do that through the online registration. And so you have to go to the FAA registration branch. And we'll provide a link for you to do that if you have an aircraft that is that large. And if you are operating an aircraft larger than 55 pounds, know that you're outside the Part 117 regulations that we're talking about. So there's extra paperwork that's got to be done on top of that as well. And then commercial registrations can be used as a hobbyist registration. So if you're going to be operating commercially and then you say, well, I want to operate my unmanned aircraft for hobbyists as well. Maybe you got kids or something that you want to take out flying. If you get a commercial registration, it can be used as a hobbyist. You do not have to define it differently other than when you go out, you mentally know that you are doing a hobbyist or hobbyist flight, and then that commercial registration will apply to your hobbyist flight. It does not work the other way around. If you have a hobbyist registration, you cannot operate commercial with it, nor is there a process currently to take your hobbyist registration and make it a commercial registration. Some other ones, you must yield the right-of-way to other aircraft. You may use a visual observer, but it's not required. So visual observer is a secondary person that stands next to you as you fly. Maybe it's just like you see here. The gentleman here has these first-person view goggles on, and he cannot directly see that aircraft. So he cannot maintain visual line of sight with that aircraft. However, if he had a secondary person standing right next to him and telling him, looking at the airspace around the aircraft and telling them, hey, there's something coming into the area, he can flip up his hood, and that visual observer can help guide him to get away from that traffic or whatever the case may be. Now, if you want to operate singly, and let's say you're a realtor and you're wanting to fly over a particular house to take pictures, you can do that as a single pilot without a visual observer. It is not required as long as you maintain visual line of sight with that aircraft. The last thing on here is first-person view camera cannot satisfy the see and avoid requirement. But as long as you but you can be used as long as the requirement is satisfied in other ways, which would be through the visual observer, as we talked about here above. Again, looking through these goggles here or looking at a screen that's on top of your controller does not meet the see and avoid requirement stated in the Part 107 regulations. Now, if you want to look at your screen to see what the camera is collecting and move the camera around and everything, that is perfectly fine. You can look up to see the aircraft, and as long as the aircraft's in view, you can look back down at your screen and just make a constant scan back and forth. That's perfectly acceptable. However, having these on, these first-person view goggles, where it's completely restricting your view to only what you're seeing on here, is not meeting the requirement. Some other ones here that we're just going to highlight really quickly is going to be, you can have a maximum ground speed of 100 miles per hour, so you can't go faster than 100. The minimum weather visibility is 3 miles from the control station or where you're standing. So you need to be able to see out 3 miles and maintain clear of clouds in that area. And most normal weather apps that, weather.com and those, they will not tell you this particular information. The way that you can do that is through aviation weather resources. And as part of your remote pilot command certification, that is what you would go over, is how to look up those sources to determine that distance. There are ways to determine that visually as well, but just know that there are definitive ways to determine that distance through aviation weather. No person may act as the remote pilot command or VO for more than one unmanned aircraft at a time. So if you want to fly 2 unmanned aircraft, that's going to fall outside the Part 107 regulations. 1 unmanned aircraft and 1 visual observer if you're using 1-to-1 aircraft operation. No operations from a moving aircraft. I know that one may seem silly to some of you, but it's not a uncommon practice to actually do that for a larger aircraft, particularly for research and looking forward at some of the larger scale operations that are coming down the line over the next couple of years. No operations from a moving vehicle unless the operation is over sparsely populated areas. So you can actually operate the unmanned aircraft from a moving vehicle if you're in a sparsely populated area. It's up to you to define what sparsely populated area is. I would err on the side of caution with that as you do that operation, and just know that you cannot be driving, operating the vehicle, and operating the unmanned aircraft at the same time. You have to have somebody else driving for you. So one particular case where it worked really well for us is we were doing a power line inspection, and we had a UTV. We had a person operating the UTV, and we had the pilot operating the unmanned aircraft as we followed the aircraft along. All the other rules were applied. We had to stay within visual line of sight. We had to operate at speeds less than 100 miles per hour, and all those other factors that play into that. But it was a completely legal operation because we were in a sparsely populated area. No careless or reckless operations. Obviously, that one's pretty subjective, but just be cautious of what you're doing and where you're doing it. No carriage of hazardous materials. Usually what I tell everybody is that if you don't think that you can take it on a manned aircraft, like on an airline, likely you're not able to carry it on a unmanned aircraft. Now, a lot of people say, well, my aircraft either operates off gas or lithium polymer batteries. If it is the fuel source for that aircraft, it is legal to fly it. However, if you were to carry, for whatever reason, a secondary battery that is not used for the purpose of that flight, that's a hazardous material and is not able to be used for that. Requires pre-flight inspection by the RPIC. On the manned side, where I grew up and came through through my professional career, we have to have what's called an airworthiness certificate. It's a really long, in-depth, really expensive process to actually get aircraft certified to fly in the National Aerospace System. For unmanned aircraft, small unmanned aircraft, that's not the case. It is up to the remote piloting command to do a thorough inspection prior to every single flight to ensure that that aircraft is in an airworthy condition. The ultimate responsibility always lies with the remote piloting command. The remote piloting command has always got to make the decision whether it is safe or not safe to fly. And if it is not safe to fly, they really need to abide by that. Doesn't matter what the boss or what deadlines they're trying to meet, because if something goes wrong, guess who's going to get in trouble with the federal government. And the last one on here is RPIC may not operate a UES if he or she knows or has known of a physical or mental condition that would interfere with the safe operation. So a good example is, let's say the night before you go out to fly a commercial operation or even a hobbyist operation, doesn't matter, and you took a bunch of NyQuil just because you've been fighting a cold. You go out there the next day, you're still kind of drowsy from the medication. That is not operating safely, and you're not abiding by this regulation. So there's a lot more that go into whether you're in a physical and mental condition to fly, but that's just one of the examples I like to use. All right, so many of you are probably thinking, man, there's a lot of things that you can't do. And essentially what the regulations are, they are limitations. You know, everything I listed off is what you essentially cannot do, you know, what you can and cannot do. But there's a lot of things that you can't do. And so a lot of people think, wow, there's a lot of things I can't do. Well, there are ways around that. So if you want to operate, let's say at night, there's a thing called waivers. And so you can actually apply through an online portal on the FAA website to obtain a waiver that allows you to fly at night. So down here in this box, I got this highlighted here. Here's all the regulations. These are the number of the regulations as is stated in 107, CFR Part 107. These are the regulations that are allowed to be waived. And not every one of them is listed out here on here for obvious reasons. There's just some things that they don't allow to be waived. But one of them is daylight operations. Essentially what that means is that this is the regulation saying that you can only operate during daylight or in that civil twilight that we talked about, where it's 30 minutes after the sun goes down or 30 minutes before the sun comes up. So if you want to operate at night for whatever reason, you can actually apply for a waiver to do that. And the nighttime waiver process is probably one of the easier ones to obtain. But for each one of these, doesn't matter which one it is, you have to present a credible safety case to the FAA, telling them why you're doing the operation and how you're going to maintain an equivalent level of safety by doing that operation. So some of them, like at night, they're pretty straightforward. Others, like flying beyond line of sight, beyond the visual line of sight, that is very hard at this time to convince FAA to do that for obvious reasons. There's a lot more complexity to operating beyond where you can't see. You know, if you're operating unmanned aircraft beyond where you cannot see, how do you see and avoid other aircraft in that National Airspace System? And so it's a lot more difficult to convince them of that. But if there's certain things that you're like, wow, I really need to be doing this operation that's not currently allowed, you need to go reference these regulations and see what which ones that you're allowed to waive. There's also authorizations, which is only for operations in certain airspace. So the classes of airspace that I mentioned that you cannot operate in, if you wanted to operate in one of those, you could either apply for a waiver or an authorization, but the authorization is basically a shortened period of time, usually about less than 6 months that you're allowed to operate in there. And as long as you're operating within a couple constraints that the FAA lists out, you can likely get approval to do that in a short amount of time. However, it is still recommended that you submit waivers and authorizations at least 90 days in advance. Depending on the complexity and associated risks that are in that operation, it may take a couple days. If it's a really simple authorization in a low risk environment, or it may take much more than 90 days or a complete denial from the FAA if it's more complex and you don't meet the equivalent level of safety. So to operate a UAS commercially, you must obtain a Remote Pilot and Command Certificate, the RPIC. And to do that, you must be at least 16 years old, be able to read, speak, write, and understand the English language, be in a physical and mental condition to safely operate the aircraft, and pass an initial aeronautical knowledge exam at an FAA-approved testing center. So this one here is the important part. You actually will have to go to a center to take this test. It's not an online exam. We'll talk a little bit more about that here. So what does the test involve? And if you've researched any of this, you probably understand that it's not the easiest test in the world to take for obvious reasons. You're operating in an environment that others, manned aircraft, may be operating in. So kind of like a driver's license, you got to go through quite a bit to get your driver's license certificate. The same thing applies, except for it's for operating in the National Airspace System. So for the remote pilot test, you must know and understand the applicable regulations relating to UAS privileges, limitations, flight operations. So a lot of the limitations that we talked about are the regulations that we just went over. It's just a lot more in depth into the finer details of what you can and cannot do. One of the two harder things to take on the test and pass is going to be the airspace section. Airspace classification and flight restrictions affecting small unmanned aircraft operations. So what I have here, and you probably saw this on a couple other slides, is called a sectional chart. It's used by manned aviation and unmanned for commercial operations to determine what type of airspace you're going to be operating in. And depending on these rings and where you're at is going to determine where you're at. However, it's not like a road map necessarily where it's a 2D. It's pictured in 2D, but it's actually a 3D representation. So it's a little bit difficult for people to visualize that these rings popping off the map. So it does take some time to actually comprehend what's happening there. So if you start studying for the test and you start getting into these and you don't have any assistance to help you, you're really going to struggle with this without some outside source, outside instructional source to help you. The second thing that's also really hard to understand is going to be the aviation weather section. So as I mentioned before, there's specific weather for that's for aviation flights. And so one of the things that they expect you to do is be able to actually read these charts and even know what this is over here. So these are, this is actually an aviation weather report for a certain location, a particular airport in this case. And you're expected to actually be able to decode this information. It looks just like a bunch of letters and numbers, and that's because it is, but it is in a certain order that you actually need to be able to pull that information out and be able to read that forecast so that way you can actually answer the question correctly on the exam. Not the easiest thing to comprehend, and it's not the easiest thing to cover on the test without some kind of instruction. Some other things is you need to know the small unmanned aircraft loading and performance, and that's particularly towards the aircraft center of gravity and the effect that different weather characteristics have on the aircraft. So there's a thing that we call that's high density altitude, which means that you're not having as good of performance as you would if you had a low density altitude. And what happens when you're flying at higher altitudes, like let's say you're out in Colorado or you're here in Kansas versus down on the coast. So Different areas have different types of performance on your unmanned aircraft, and you need to know how those characteristics affect your aircraft performance. And of course, you're also going to need to know emergency procedures for your particular aircraft. You know, what do you do if a motor fails, or what happens if the ground station actually crashes? What are the procedures that are involved into that, and how do they play into the regulations that are set by the federal government? A few other things, going to be crew resource management. If this is a foreign term to you, it simply means how do you operate as a crew. So a lot of these smaller commercial grade aircraft, consumer grade aircraft, can be operated by one person. However, if you're wanting to operate a larger aircraft for, let's say, an organization, or even one of the smaller consumer grade aircraft you're flying and you have a payload operator, somebody operating the camera, there needs to be communication happening between those two individuals. And we call that crew resource management. How do you manage your workload effectively and safely between the both of you? Or in some cases, we have small unmanned aircraft that are below 55 pounds that require 5 to 6 people to operate. And they're completely within the Part 117 regulations if we want to operate within those. But the way that we communicate needs to be defined specifically, so that way there's no errors or few errors while we're flying. And then radio communication procedures. If you're wanting to operate in certain types of airspace, some of those airspaces that we were originally talking about where you aren't allowed to fly without a waiver or authorization, there may be a requirement for you to actually communicate over the radio to air traffic control. That's likely not going to be the case, but it's still there as a requirement. So if that does happen, then you need to know how to communicate with the radio. And it's not a foreign language, but it's not far from it either. It does take a little bit of training to know how to operate the radio. And then the last couple things here, we talked about determining the performance, physiological effects of drugs and alcohol, how those affect your flying judging, which it does, obviously. Aeronautical decision-making and judgment, so making the right decision. Maybe the winds are a little bit high that day, maybe the weather's not just quite right, you've been a little sick. How do you make those decisions that are in the best interest of safety for your operation? Airport operations, so if you're going to be operating near an airport, how do you know how those manned aircraft are going to be flying in that area? So there's a particular way that manned aircraft come into an airport, fly, land, take off, and you need to know how those operate, so that way when you're operating your unmanned aircraft, you know the proper procedures to interact with those manned aircraft. And then maintenance and pre-flight inspection procedures. So again, prior to every flight, the remote pilot command must look over the aircraft and make sure that the aircraft is in airworthy condition. And if it's not, there needs to be maintenance done, whether it's routine or preventative maintenance, or maintenance after an incident. You need to be able to document all that stuff and keep it in proper records. So once you take the exam and pass it, you're going to receive what the Remote Piloting Command Certificate. And so that looks just like this one here. And when you go out to fly, this certificate would be in your wallet and or on your possession, and it must be accompanied with a photo ID. So you must have this and a current photo ID with you at all times while you're flying. It must be easily accessible by the remote pilot during the operation at all times. So if an authoritative figure shows up and they want to see your documentation, you need to be able to access that pretty easily to them. You can't be digging through your truck or car looking for the documentation. It needs to be on you. It is valid for 2 years. The certificate holder must pass a recurrent knowledge test every 2 years. So as it stands right now with the regulations, once you receive this, every 2 years, you're going to have to retake that test to get the certification again. So I put up a couple test example questions that you may see on the test if you're going to take the commercial pilot test to receive your remote piloting command certificate. So while monitoring Cooperstown CTAF, Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, you hear an aircraft announce that they are on midfield left downwind to runway 13. Where would that aircraft be relative to your runway? Now, I'm not going to give you the answer. I'm not going to put up a poll or anything, but as you can probably tell, if you haven't been in aviation, this is kind of wish-wash. There's not a lot of information that you can use from outside sources that you grew up with, unless it was in aviation, that actually helps you with this question. You really need to know the intricacies of how manned aircraft work and how airports work to answer this question. The next one is refer to figure 12, which I have down here at the bottom. And it says, what are the current conditions for Chicago Midway Airport, this KMDW? If we actually look down here, I'll tell you it's right here, KMDW. And it's asking you what this, to decode this weather report and say which one of these questions, or which one of these answers is correct. Which one of these is what it is saying inside this line here. And so you have to be able to train yourself to understand and decode what is being said here to get the correct answer. And the last thing, I don't have a question for it, but we talked specifically about this already a little bit, but understanding the sectional charts or the aviation maps associated with flying unmanned aircraft or manned aircraft, it doesn't matter, they use the same ones. And knowing where you're operating, whether you're operating out here or you're operating inside one of these rings, knowing where you're at and what that means. So if you're operating out here, it means you fall under different restraints than you do in here. So knowing where you're at is essential. And then again, probably the hardest thing that that people struggle with here is actually knowing how to take this and make it a 3D model, because this is depicted as a 2D model, and you need to be able to train your mind to actually extend this into a 3D image. And so each one of these rings is a different layer, and we call it the upside down wedding cake. And essentially, if you took a crude wedding cake and turned it upside down with the core being right here, these are different rings and different levels that the airspace is operating at. So whether you're operating underneath it or in it is vital. And so looking at it from a 2D mindset, it's pretty hard to do. And I would say that if you're trying to self-study, it would almost be impossible to really get this without having a lot of external sources to aid you with in understanding one of these maps. So there is a way that we can help here at K-State, as I mentioned. As soon as the regulations came out in August of 2016, we started offering courses specifically to help those that want to get a commercial remote pilot command certificate. Those courses, as it stands right now, is a commercial remote pilot certification training course, which is 3 days. It's 3 days in the classroom, covering all those topics that we just got talking about. You know, the regulations, the performance, the airspace, weather, all those and many more that is required for you to pass the exam. Again, when you go to take that exam, it is required that you do that at a FAA training or FAA testing facility. And so you can't just do it online or walk into, you know, any place on the map. So you need to be able to do that at a FAA approved site. Kansas State University here at the Polytechnic campus, we do have one of those sites available to us. It's right here on our campus. So we actually offer the 3-day course, and on the 4th day, students actually go in and take the exam right after, which is really, really helpful because that information is right there at the forefront of their mind, and they can go in there and take the test. Some other things that we do offer, you know, there is something to be said about the flight training aspects of this. So if you want to get better at flying your unmanned aircraft or get basic instruction, we do provide a basic multi-rotor course, a 2-day course that just teaches you the basic of your unmanned aircraft, how to, you know, essentially calibrate the compass and, you know, what the GPS is doing, and, you know, how to deal with emergency procedures and stuff like that, and how to just really have a good situational control of the aircraft. We also offer a multi-rotor night training course. So we do have a waiver granted to us by the FAA to actually fly at night, and we use that mainly for doing training. So we'll actually take you out in the night and take you out to fly unmanned aircraft and show you how it's a little bit different flying at night. There's a lot of different visual illusions that we are required to teach you, and that way you understand. That way when you're on your own, if you get one of those visual illusions, you know how to overcome that. If you want basically the full enchilada and you want to really understand all there is to know about your multi-rotor UAS, we do offer a 5-day advanced multi-rotor course that teaches you everything from the basic all the way up to doing autonomous missions for your system. So programming in different waypoints and different altitude speeds, as far as collecting imagery, what camera sets and everything to use. And that's a 5-day course, and it's pretty intensive and very, very informative for you. Some other ones, a fixed wing training course. If you have a fixed wing aircraft, we do offer a 10-day course for that. A data processing course. So a lot of people fly these and then they don't know what to do with the data. Well, we offer a training course that actually helps you process that data, whether you're trying to get 3D models or how to store the data, and a lot of different things on how to, what you do on the back end once you actually collect that data. And also how to put in the correct camera settings so that we collect the imagery, the correct imagery up front. And we also have a business development course if you're wanting to start your own business and get the basics on how to do that. More information on that can be found here at ksu-uas.com. You can click on training and it'll have all the information on the current courses that we have, the dates that they're available, and what's coming up in the near future. Again, that'll be on the email that comes out here really soon. Some future courses that are coming out here this year. Hopefully, most of these will be out this year. The first one's going to be a law enforcement U.S. training, flight training. It'll be specifically for law enforcement. Doesn't mean you have to be in law enforcement to take it, but it'll be what law enforcement needs to know to be able to operate the unmanned aircraft for law enforcement activities. So search and rescue, search and rescue, a fugitive, crime scene reconstruction, all those things will be included into that course. Law Enforcement UAS 101, so it'd be similar to this one, except for it'll be a law enforcement focus, where we'll actually talk about what you as a law, or what those as a law enforcement can actually do if they get called out to an incident where a UAS has either been crashed or somebody's flying over somebody else's land or something of the sort. So what they can and cannot do. Emergency management, which would be if there is a natural disaster, how to utilize unmanned aircraft systems for that. Fire department, which I think is pretty self-explanatory, using it to aid in fire suppression activities. And then industrial inspection, so pipeline, power infrastructure, any one of those linear infrastructure will be able to help with those. And then just to wrap everything up, some other services that we provide, of course, is consulting services. So if you wanted some consulting for your business or how to use UAS or what type of UAS to buy, we can certainly provide that service. We conduct applied research. We are the Applied Aviation Research Center, so that's one of our go-tos. That's what we do. Commercial operations, if a local farmer or anybody across the United States wants to hire us to do commercial work, flying unmanned aircraft systems to do a particular operation, we actually offer those services. We have a wide variety of unmanned aircraft that can usually accomplish just about anything that needs to be done out there for UAS operations. Sensor integration. If you want to put a particular sensor on an unmanned aircraft and it's never been done before, we can certainly help with that, setting up the wiring and the payload and ensuring that's on the right aircraft and all those factors that play into that. Of course, there's UAS repair. If you've flown your unmanned aircraft and had unfortunately ran into a tree or the ground too fast, we offer repair services to actually fix those aircraft. And of course, there's FAA test site operations, which is our most recent offering for those operations that can't be done on a Part 117 that are a little bit more complex. We do have a test site that now allows us to do that through our test complex. For more information on that, again, it's at that ksu-uas.com. That's a commercial site. And then if you're young or not young and want to get into unmanned aircraft systems and really want to make a career out of this and really want to invest into it, we do have our college academic programs. We actually have 2 of them that I kind of mentioned before. One of them is going to be the professional pilot. The flight operations, which is for those that want to be pilots. And then we have our engineering technology, which would be more of design, build, fly type operations. So how do you build the aircraft and make them more viable for the current industry? All right, now that my mouth is completely dry, we're going to take about 2 minutes here. I'm going to review all the questions that come through. They've said there's quite a few, and it does look like there's quite a few as I'm looking at the screen here. So let's take about 2 to 3 minutes. I'm going to shut off the camera just for a minute so I can grab a drink, look through these questions, and then we'll go into these questions that I have here and kind of go over those. And feel free to keep sending them in as we go through these. and I'll see you in just a couple minutes. All right, everyone. I I got some questions pulled up here, and I think we're going to go through and answer some of these. So feel free to keep them coming. Both of these guys over here are working hard to get them written up for me so I can actually read them and talk to you guys out here. So the first question is, does the FAA provide guidance for the number of social media followers or YouTube subscribers where it goes from hobbyist to commercial? And the answer is no, they do not define that number. However, the point is that when you actually start getting compensated by YouTube for the content that you're uploading, or Facebook or any social media source, that's when it becomes on the commercial side. So if you are uploading content and you have, let's say 1,000 viewers, that view that content, that's perfectly fine as long as you're not commercially benefiting off of that on the back end from YouTube. The next question is, the 400-foot altitude safety tip just a recommendation for hobbyists? So the answer is yes. For hobbyists, it is highly recommended that you do not operate higher than 400 feet, but it is just a recommended. So they suggest that you operate lower than 400 feet. And again, the reason behind that is that once you get above 400 feet, you get into that situation of you're interacting with those operators in the national airspace system. And if you looked at the commercial regulations, we're not even allowed above 400 feet unless around a tower or something like that where you can extend that higher. But once you start interacting with manned aircraft, it gets a little bit uneasy in the FAA's mind, because if there was an interaction where a manned aircraft came in to that area, you have to be able to get away from the aircraft. You have to be able to make sure that you do not collide with that aircraft. And from the ground, the higher you get, the harder it is to see how high you are compared to visually to that manned aircraft. And so that can be kind of cumbersome when it gets to higher altitudes. Pulling up the next one here. Is herbicide or pesticide considered as a hazardous material? The best thing I want to say to this is, yes, I would consider it a hazardous material, but this is more my personal thought. This is one of the, I don't want to call it a gray area, but it's one of those areas where it's not well defined. And so the best suggestion and the safest and honest way that I'm going to suggest to you to make this as legal as possible is reach out to your local Flight Standards District Office, or FSDO. We will provide a link in the email to come that actually allows you to find the one that's closest to you and actually ask that question. We get it asked often, and it's not clearly defined whether you can actually use a UAS to spray. Before the regulations came out, it was no. And then once they came out, as far as commercially, it's been kind of fuzzy on whether whether that operation is legal or not. So the best answer I can give you is that at this time to contact your local Flight Standards District Office. That way it's noted by them that you're actually doing that operation. So if they say yes, at least you have that yes from them. I don't want to take responsibility for saying, yeah, you can do that because the guy on, K-State's webinar said so. So we'll provide a link for you to do that. Next question is, small manned aircraft normally operate using MSL, or mean sea level altitude. How do we know that the UAS above ground level altitude is lower than the aircraft's altitude? And this kind of gets into the complexity of getting the certification and understanding how to interpolate what altitude the manned aircraft operate in, which is mean sea level, which means that the altitude actually goes from sea level and up. That's what they set their altimeters to, and that's what they fly off of, versus our manned aircraft, at least most of them, operate off above ground level. So how high are we flying above the ground? And so there is a difference there in the numbers that they read out. However, again, manned aircraft are typically not going to fly lower than 500 feet AGL, which is automatically included into their MSL numbers. So if they're flying at a certain altitude, they know that depending on their area and their current elevations at those areas of what 500 feet above ground level is going to be in their MSL standard. So you as a unmanned aircraft operator looking at an AGL number can and should interpolate that number to an MSL. That way you can also, let's say you're operating next to an airport and you hear over the radio that they're at, 3,000 feet MSL. Well, that's a lot different than 3,000 feet AGL. So you being able to interpolate that is going to be key. So depending on your field elevation, your current elevation, that plus however high you're flying is going to be the MSL altitude comparatively to that of the main aircraft. And I know that's pretty complex. That's one of the harder questions that we got. And the course that we teach specifically goes into how to interpolate that information from unmanned to manned, or better said, from AGL to MSL. Next question is, do helicopter pads at hospitals, etc., count as an airport and restricted fly zone? As a hobbyist, yes. If you are near a heliport, a hospital that has a heliport or anything like that, then yes, you need to be more than 5 miles away from there unless you provide notification to that center, to whoever operates that heliport, letting them know. On the commercial side, it is not defined that way. It is defined as an airspace. So if there is a helipad in a certain airspace that doesn't require a waiver authorization, you can operate there. However, there is a regulation that says that you need to be able to be mindful of the airport or heliport's operation. So you need to know how they're going to come into land and what frequency they may be talking on, and how to interact in that environment. So even though that you can operate there, you still need to know the associated risks and operations that you're going to need to abide by. All right. What does the FAA say about operating commercially over traffic? And my colleague here was even nice enough to pull up a regulation saying 14 CFR Part 107.39, and it states that no person may operate a small unmanned aircraft over human beings unless that human being is located under a covered structure or inside a stationary vehicle that can provide reasonable protection from a falling small unmanned aircraft. And again, this all comes back to operating over people and the safety aspect with that. But it specifically says that the vehicle must be stationary. So if you're a Department of Transportation agency or traffic monitoring, whatever, and you want to fly over the top of moving vehicles, is not allowed under Part 107 unless you apply for a waiver. And so that goes back to that online process of convincing the FAA that your operation has an equivalent level of safety equal to, a normal operation. And how you do that is dependent on what you want to say. But if you want to operate over a moving vehicle, that is not allowed under Part 107 right when you get your certificate. Next question is, what is the definition for sparsely populated areas? This question gets asked a lot, and unfortunately, the FAA does not define sparsely populated areas. That's why when I said in here, use caution. You want to make sure that in your mind that if something were to go wrong and it went to court, this is just what I think, that you can say that you're operating in a sparsely populated area. You don't want there to be any doubt that that was a sparsely populated area. And you can look up other definitions that are out there. They won't be from the FAA, but it is up to you to determine what sparsely populated is. And like I said, you might want to use a little bit of caution to ensure that you are in a sparsely populated area. All right, next question is, can I add a second battery to my aircraft, which involves modifying the original OEM design, and still be considered legal, or would it be classified as carrying a hazardous resource? The answer is, if you are modifying your aircraft, the first thing is that you need to make sure it is in an airworthy condition, ready for flight. So that means if you modify anything on your aircraft, doesn't matter if it's small or large, you need to be able to determine that it is safe for operation. The FAA actually provides many risk assessments or analysis to determine whether your modification is safe, and for the first flight, what is the best practices to actually do that operation. So if you do a large modification, you probably don't want to have a bunch of spectators around for the first flight. You know, you want to make sure you're by yourself or the essential crews there to do that operation to make sure it's safe, along with a lot of other safety aspects. But back to the main part of the question is, will it be considered a hazardous material? The key part of that is if the battery is being used to supplement the first battery pack. So if you're using that battery to supply power to the aircraft for flight or for any control surface or anything on the aircraft, maybe the sensor or whatever, then it is okay. However, if for whatever reason you had a battery pack and it was not plugged in, it was not supplying any kind of source of power to the aircraft, that is considered a hazardous material that you're carrying at that time. And this really plays into the package delivery realm of small unmanned aircraft and what you can and cannot carry for package delivery and those regulations, which I don't think we have a question on that. Hopefully, we're not going to get into that, but that's a whole nother zoo. I don't even want to go down. But anyway, if it's supplying power, then you're going to be okay, and you're making sure that the aircraft is airworthy before flight. Next question is, I'm commercial and I need to operate in Class E, starting at 700 to 1,200 feet and outside a 5 nautical mile limit. So staying under 400 feet, I do not need a waiver authorization. Correct. What are the okay? So if you're operating, how do I want to say this? If your Class E is starting at 700 or 1,200, obviously you know a little bit about airspace. If your Class E is starting at 700 or 1,200 and you're operating underneath that, then you're going to be in Class G, and Class G is everywhere you can operate. Under 400 feet in Class G, you can operate anywhere without any need for authorization or waiver from the FAA. The Part 177 certificate is specifically built for Class G operations under 400 feet. So when your Class E starts at 700, you know, there's a gap there, and especially at 1,200. Just be cautious. It's, like I said, it sounds like you know a little bit something about airspace, that when it's Class E to the surface, that's when you start having issues. You know, when you get that dashed ring around there, that's not allowed. You're going to need permission to operate in there. And then there's a few other stipulations about operating around a tower that extends up into Class E, which actually is allowed if it's Class E, not Class B, C, or D. So if you're operating around a really large tower that extends up to, let's say, 1,000 feet AGL, you can actually operate your unmanned aircraft up and around that area, as long as you're within a 400-foot radius of that tower, up into Class E, but not into D, C, and B. Of course, not A. All right. Next question is: I am a licensed pilot, single multi-engine instrument. A lot of experience, put that way. DJI Phantom 3, and it's registered. Do I need the UAV RPIC certificate added to my license? All right. Yes, is the simplest answer. So I'm assuming all the ratings are, you know, obviously they're manned ratings. And so you're in the similar boat as me. So when these regulations came out, of course, I had all my manned certificate, license, and all that. We, as manned pilots, if your license is current, so if your biannual flight review is current, you can actually go through the online portal. So basically, we get a buy because the test requirement for the remote pilot command certificate is basically pretty dang close to the private pilot certificate. So as long as your biannual is current, you can actually go to the aviation website and check that that's going to be another thing that we're going to include in the email in a couple days. Will be the link to where you can actually go online and do their online, I call it Delta training. It's a couple things that talk about the regulations, what they involve, and then there's a short couple questions at the end that they ask you to answer. And then after that, you get a certificate. It's like a printed certificate with a number on it, and you can submit that number to the FAA through the IACRA process, the online process for aviation certification. So as a manned pilot, as long as you're current, you kind of have a buy and don't have to do this RPIC certificate. All right. What are the risks to my manned ratings if I break a UAS rule? That's a really good question. The best answer is if you do something really bad, the FAA has every right to take every license that you have. So me as a manned pilot, I have a lot of ratings. Let's just say it that way. I am extremely cautious when I operate unmanned aircraft because I have a lot to lose. And not to say that because nobody or that others are only going to have an RPIC license that they should operate recklessly, but we do as manned operators have a lot of money and time invested into those licenses. And so, there's a lot more risk associated with that. So, have I ever seen that happen, come down on somebody from the FAA because of a UAS operation? No, and this is just my opinion, but I believe that the FAA has every right to take the license or at least suspend certain licenses that you operate under, whether it's unmanned or manned. So my best advice to you is just don't break the regulations. Operate within the Part 107 regulations, and there should be no concern for you. Next question is, what do we do if the airport does not have a control tower? Is contacting the airport manager appropriate coordination? Yes. So there are certain airports that do not have control towers, depending on the size of the airport. And so those that do not have towers, contacting the airport manager is the notification that you need to provide. So contacting that number via phone and let him or her know that you're going to be operating there. And when we say notification, we literally mean notification. You do not have to actually talk to somebody, which I know may seem kind of crazy, but if you leave a message with that person and let them know that you're going to be operating in that area, that is the term notification. That is, by definition, you have notified that person. So use your best judgment when doing that, though. You could be operating in that case without anybody knowing that you're there. So it might be better to wait until you actually get a hold of somebody. So with some of this stuff, especially on the hobbyist side, it's going to be, use your best judgment and, really operate as safe as you can, because you as an unmanned operator, there's not a lot to lose other than maybe the cost of your aircraft. However, if you were to hit a manned aircraft or crash on top of somebody, there is a potential loss for life there. And so you always need to have that in the back of your mind. And a lot of people think that that's not possible, but as we've seen in the news here lately, there's been several instances where an unmanned aircraft has been spotted, and here recently 2 unmanned aircraft actually hit manned aircraft. So it is possible, and you need to use proper caution when operating. All right, next question is, can you use a drone in a parade for advertising purposes? So advertising is going to be a commercial operation. So the answer is going to be yes, you can do this, but there's a couple things that you need to know. First is that if it's for advertising, it's going to be a commercial operation. 2, that if you're going to be operating in a parade, there's obviously a lot of people, so you need to be able to position yourself to where you are not operating over the top of somebody or obtain a waiver to do that operation, which might be currently hard at this time because it's one of the harder ones to obtain as of right now. However, we have done certain operations here at K-State that are similar to a parade where there's a lot of people in the street and everything. And you can either work with whoever's coordinating the parade or whatever and section off an area to where you're directly flying over you or a certain area where nobody's allowed, or over the top of buildings as we've done before. There are ways around it, but there's definitely some considerations to take into that. And when we say not directly operating over the top of people, it is, as it is implied, directly over the top of somebody. And so if you offset, yes, you are not operating over the top of somebody. However, there is another regulation that states that if there is a failure on the aircraft, that you need to, without question, be able to definitively say that you can operate that aircraft and get it down to a position that does not adversely or does not hurt anybody on the ground or in the air. Then, how do you do that when you're just operating a couple feet away from somebody or off to the side? And the answer is you can't. You need to be able to definitively say that I'm operating in a safe environment to where I am far enough away from people to, if something was to go wrong, if I have a prop break, which does happen, a motor fail or whatever, that the aircraft would land in a safe area. Next one is on one more than occasion, I have seen a drone flying over Dylan's parking lot. You said you cannot fly over people. Do parking lots count? If there are people below the aircraft, then yes, it absolutely counts. And especially you got moving vehicles to consider there. So knowing some of the stuff coming out of this, when you see an unmanned aircraft, especially if you go through the commercial certification, you're going to see a lot of operations that you're like, how do they do that legally? And you'll see YouTube videos and stuff like that. It'll constantly go through your head. And the best answer is, there's going to be people that really push the limit and don't operate legally and several other aspects. And so the best thing I can tell you is not to be one of those people. I mentioned the fines associated with not registering an aircraft. There are much equal or much bigger fines for not following the regulations. And of course, these are federal regulations. I mean, you should not take them lightly. So being that they're federal, there's big repercussions for doing something illegal like that. Oh, this one's fun. What is one of your favorite UAS to operate? Oh man. Put me on the spot. So we have quite a few different aircraft here, and I'd say probably the most fun I've had operating on an aircraft is the DJI Mavic. I mean, that thing is really tiny and really capable. It is just incredible what that little thing can do. Even though the Inspire 2, they're very great, and I really like them for the multi-use and everything as far as aircraft operator and payload operator, but the Mavic really does an outstanding job just for a single pilot operator. And I'm saying this specifically is if I was to buy one for a hobbyist operation, that's probably what I'd go with. Now, one of the more nerve-wracking aircraft I've flown would be UAV Factory Penguin B. So a larger fixed-wing aircraft, about 35 pounds or so. And it does take, that crew of 5 to 6 people to operate. And so it's really fun. There's a lot more complexity to it, and that makes it really interesting. So thanks for that question. It's a fun one. When is the best time to listen to NOTAMs? So NOTAMs, we'll provide a link for those as well. They're pushed out through the NOTAM website, amongst other places, but you can listen, or you can look at the NOTAMs through the website at any given time. So that's one of the easiest things to do. A lot of the UAS apps that are out there, once you start operating these things to know what airspace you're operating in, they'll actually have a NOTAM section. And if you're looking for a good app to get, I would make sure that it contains weather, it contains NOTAMs, temporary flight restrictions, and airspace in general, just to make sure that you're covering most of your bases there. So as far as other aspects of knowing whether you're operating in one of those restricted airspaces, just make sure you do your due diligence and look up the other restrictions that may be applied there. All right, I think we're winding down on questions here. Can I register commercially if I don't have my RPIC yet? Can I operate a UAS as a hobbyist if I have a commercial registration number on it? All right, so two parts of this. So can you operate commercially if you don't have an RPIC yet? And the answer is maybe. If you are operating with somebody else that does have a remote pilot and command certificate. So if I, like I do, I have my remote pilot and command certificate and you don't, if I am standing next to you or if I'm nearby and I have the ability to take immediate control of that aircraft, whether that's through just handing over the controller or a buddy box system, or there's a couple other options through the autopilot, then yes, you can be operating the aircraft, and it works really well for training as well. However, if you want to go out and fly on your own and video or film something for a commercial purpose, the answer is no. You cannot do it without your remote pilot and command certificate or temporary certificate that they give you before it comes in. What was the second part of that? Can I operate a UAS as a hobbyist if I have a commercial registration on it? Yes. So the hobbyist registration, if you get a hobbyist registration, cannot be used for a commercial registration or operation. However, a commercial registration can be used for a hobbyist flight. So if you have an aircraft, let's say it's a Phantom 4, popular aircraft, you have a Phantom 4 that you use to do aerial cinematography for weddings and you get paid for it. That's your commercial operation with a commercial registration number. But then on the weekends, you want to take your son out, or you just want to go out and have fun with it and get some scenic shots for your own personal enjoyment. You can do that as a hobbyist with the commercial registration number. You can use that commercial registration number as a hobbyist. All right, and then we're going to wrap it up with this last one. Best app besides Before You Fly. Oh man, there's a lot of them out there, and I highly suggest that you look at the ones out there that best suits your needs. There's a lot of them that are up and coming, and this is a great industry to be in because the technology is advancing so fast, and so are these support services. So I highly encourage you to look at what really works well for you. One of the ones that does work well for us is AirMap. AirMap is what is actually already on all your DJI products as far as the map goes. So AirMap works really well for us because it's already integrated. For our non-DJI systems, which there's a lot of them, you can still use AirMap as an outside source, but there are many others out there that you can use besides Before You Fly. Yeah, one of my guys here just said AirMap. It also gives you the airspace you are in and any phone numbers to contact. So if you're operating in a certain area and you're within that, either the 5 nautical mile ring or you're operating commercially and you're next to an airport, it's going to give you the contact numbers for the control tower. So that's an easy way to get a hold of those people without having to go through the airport manager. So that is a nice benefit. All right, guys, if your question was not answered, we'll be sending out an email in the next couple of days to actually answer that. We'll actually list out all these too, and that way if you may have missed what I said, we can certainly address those. I really appreciate everybody taking the time. I thought this was a really good event, and hopefully it was really informative for all of you as well. Feel free to contact us on our commercial site. There's plenty of resources there for direct contact to us. So we're happy to answer any questions that you may have specifically. And if you're looking for a way to get commercially certified, we can definitely help with that if you want that, or any other of the services that we mentioned. So I really appreciate your time, and thank you, and have a great evening and rest of your week.